Okay, thank you all again for being here today and so early. I'm sure you are all fairly sick of Zoom, so I appreciate it. As Noah said, my name is Stephanie. I use she and they pronouns, and if you were here for the first kind of foundational training, I'm going to do a little review. So bear with us on that. And yeah, as Noah said, I'm the director of Project Let's. We're really focused on building peer support collectives in higher ed, as Noah mentioned, and community mental health structures. I am a graduate from Brown University in 2017, so fairly recent, and still doing a lot of work with folks on campus. I threw up some of my lived experience on the screen to just kind of give y'all an idea of where I'm coming from. In addition to a professional lens from this work, it's personal. I do have a lot of lived experience, and I'm happy to, address questions that come up in this realm. If anything does come up, we will try to save some time at the end for questions. But if you have something that's coming up in the beginning, or throughout the training, feel free to send it in the chat and I will do my best to address as we go. Just a quick note on access. Access-centered practices are really important for everyone, especially when we're coming to work from a disability justice lens and perspective. So please feel free to use this space you are in as you prefer. If you'd like to keep your camera on or off, that's up to you. If you'd like to lay in your bed or lay on the floor or be doodling, whatever you need to do to show up in the way that you want is totally okay by us. And just a quick note on some community guidelines. I really believe that judgment and curiosity can't coexist. So hopefully we can show up in this space today in a place of wanting to learn and unlearn, and be curious about experiences that we may not have, lived experience with. We want to sunset and encourage participation. So if you're someone who tends to take up a lot of space and is comfortable speaking in front of groups, that's great. But we want to watch that and also encourage folks who don't usually have space to talk about their experience to share those thoughts with us. And you can share your thoughts in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and speak, whatever is more comfortable for you. Also, what's said here stays here. If there are students in this room who are sharing their experiences, I just encourage folks who do work for the university to approach that in a confidential manner and keep the contents of the workshop within this space. We also want to be embracing principled struggle. It is okay for us to disagree, not about, basic human rights, and that people are deserving of not being disposed and not being harmed, but there are definitely going to be different perspectives here and we welcome all of those. I encourage you to ask questions, to stay on mute unless you are speaking, just so we can minimize the background noise. I also encourage folks to use I statements. If somebody says something that is offensive or harmful or upsetting, please do correct, but correct gently. And we want to assume good intentions in this space. And definitely encouraging folks to lean into discomfort. So there might be perspectives that I share or things that come up in this workshop that might be very different from what you are used to. For example, I think a lot of folks have an understanding, an idea of certain types of mental illness, particularly with altered states and mania or psychosis, as being inherently dangerous. And I'm going to ask us to really challenge that today. So I encourage folks to really lean into that discomfort, and hopefully we can all be growing and moving forward together. Okay, I'm going to switch. This was our kind of grounding question for breakout rooms, but since there are so many new folks here, I'm going to switch that question. So we're going to spend about 5 minutes in breakout rooms. And the question is, I just sent it in the chat. Who are you in a crisis? What are your presets and how do you show up? So this is thinking about, if somebody around you is having, a mental health crisis, if somebody has a seizure, if somebody is in an escalated state, who are you? How do you show up? Are you somebody who's going to be calm, cool, and collected, or start kind of freaking out? And this is, not to judge anyone, but if we're going to be engaging in crisis response work, in bystander intervention, we have to know our biases and our presets. So hoping we can just spend about 5 or 6 minutes in these groups, sharing some thoughts on this. So recording again. Okay. So for those of you who, I think the majority of you were not here for the prior training, and again, I'll make sure everyone gets all of the slides. We were basically kind of setting the stage for today. We were talking about some of the foundations of disability justice, of transformative justice, of intersectionality that are really important for us to be thinking about when we are working with students on campus, folks on campus. We need to be thinking about how identity impacts what our potential relationship would be with a campus police officer, or how comfortable we are engaging with certain circumstances. For a white wealthy student who is not on financial aid, if they are maybe sent to a psychiatric unit by their school, maybe they stay a few days and they come back and everything is kind of sorted. And if you have a lower income student of color who's on financial aid, who maybe hasn't had conversations with their parents about their lived experience with mental health, that type of situation could be radically different from what a white, wealthy, maybe non-disabled student might experience. So I really want to encourage us to really be thinking through an intersectional lens, meaning that, identities, marginalized identities, are going to converge and create special burdens of discrimination and special experiences that folks with other identities may not experience. And especially in our current climate with policing and specifically thinking about the intersections of Black folks and policing, we need to make sure that our campuses are not inherently replicating oppressive dynamics that we find outside of our campuses. And it's absolutely our responsibilities collectively as students, as folks who work for the university, to be thinking of non-directive ways to support folks. I think a lot of people will immediately go to worst case scenario. We have to call the police, we have to call 911, when there are so often many, many steps that can be taken before that has to occur. So I'm hoping today we can go through some of that. And I'm just gonna quickly kind of review some of the crisis skills that we set the stage with last week. So in terms of crisis response, what we want to avoid at all costs is not thinking about these things in advance, right? Because then we get to a situation and we don't know what to do. And we start reacting from a position of power as opposed to a position of partnership, right? So a lot of what we can do, and is what you're doing here today, by not waiting until that crisis or that threat or that danger, but start thinking right now, what do I have to work with? What are my resources? What types of situations could come up, and where can I go in the community for support? And again, we've been talking a little bit about delegating, getting other people involved. What are those boundaries? And we'll talk about that. But just briefly, it should take a lot of forethought, right, to get these other systems involved. Because as I just mentioned, there's a lot at stake, right? You could be taking someone out of school, out of their work, out of the rhythm of their life, changing and disrupting family dynamics. So we really want to be thinking very clearly about what we're doing, planning ahead of time, and trying not to negotiate those responses from a position of power. So this is the question that I asked you all in the breakout rooms. And how many of you have heard, you can just say yes or no in the chat, of this model of the stretch zone, comfort zone, danger, or panic zone? Is this new? Have we heard of this? Just want to get some input. No. New to me. New. Okay, awesome. New. Great. So we use this model in our trainings for students. So one of the things that Project Let's does is we train students on campus to do peer support work, peer counseling, and advocacy services. We train students who have lived experience to support others, and we talk about this a lot. And I've also use this model in talking with other white folks about anti-racist work. So thinking about how a lot of us live in the comfort zone. That is where, we're comfortable, we feel safe. Comfort zone can also include, what are presets, right? If you're the person who's going to start freaking out or the person who's going to stay calm, that's your comfort zone. The stretch zone is like, we haven't approached the panic zone, we're not in danger, but we're thinking about maybe new decisions we can make. We're trying some new things out that are maybe outside of what we're used to. And the panic zone is like danger moment, like that is not good. We are now entering a crisis ourselves. And that's what we want to avoid at all costs, right? When we're doing this type of work, we don't want to join in the crisis of someone else. We want as much as possible to have our positionality and our mindset grounded, so that we're not escalating, right? I have a 1-year-old who is adorable, but also if you have kids, you know how 1-year-olds are. And if she is escalated and crying, I can't possibly calm her down if I'm also escalated, right? I need to first ground myself. I need to like take a step outside, deep breaths, whatever that is to ground you. And then I can approach her. Because if I'm like, oh my God, stop crying, and she's crying, now she's crying more, and we're both crying, and it's a mess, right? So we don't want to go to the danger zone, but I want to encourage us to think about our stretch zone when we're in crisis response work. We know maybe where we're at, what our comfort level is, and we want to be moving towards a place where we're maybe trying some new strategies and thinking of new ways that don't put us in that panic zone. And I showed this slide last week. We're not going to fully go through all of this today, but this is something that I encourage you, this work, you're not going to leave this workshop today a brand new person. I hope that you gain a lot of information and a lot of new thoughts and some skills. But this is, ongoing work. And, I'm sharing this resource for you to hopefully kind of continue to go through and do that work on your own time, thinking about what are my personal barriers to intervention, right? Some people will say, well, I don't really know, like, if the situation's an emergency or not, so I'm just like not going to get involved. Or maybe that person is scared that they'll get in trouble. Maybe they know the person who's in crisis or they don't know them, and that's kind of a barrier. Some people just like do not want to rock the boat. They don't like conflict, not wanting attention, feeling nervous, seeing that no one else is doing anything. So like, why am I going to do something? It's important to kind of know where we're at. What are our personal barriers? Because the only way that we can really move forward is by knowing that, addressing that. Oop. This is a resource that we use. Hold on, let me just let someone in. Okay. This is a resource we use called Taking Inventory. So I definitely encourage you all to go through this activity. Basically, again, thinking about the first box is the individual and personal skills, right? What are your personal limits? So that would be when you would move into that panic or danger zone, right? So maybe if you have this boundary with yourself that you have to call for backup if there's a gun or a domestic violence situation happening. We want to think through again, what are our defaults? What would you normally do? Is that what you would do if you had more time to think? Community resources. This is not just like, you have maybe the counseling center, disability services, your Department of Public Safety. We want to also be thinking of community members or more grassroots types of groups. Like, who do we know who can do some conflict resolution? Who's really good at talking to someone who's upset or angry? There are some colleges who are starting to have some transformative justice programs on campuses that are providing some like mediation and conflict resolution with students on campus. That could be something to look into as well. And for the last question, right, what would you need in order to respond to situations in a way that you would like? Maybe you're noticing that on campus, you don't have those resources yet. Maybe you don't have that transformative justice program, you don't have the peer counselors, and a lot of the solutions tend to be more carceral, meaning that we're involving police, we're involving, forcing students into psychiatric hospitalizations or forced medical leaves. And what resources can we build to try and circumvent that typical solution that we keep engaging with? So this taking inventory tool I find really useful. Again, you will all have slides and be able to kind of go through this and use these in your work. How many of you have heard of pod mapping? Is this new? Send in the chat yes or no. It's a wonderful tool. New. Oh, can y'all hear me?
We can hear you now. I think you cut out for a minute.
Okay. All right. Sorry, y'all. Computers are lovely. Yes, I was just saying I'm like 2 in this work, so I always assume everyone knows what I'm talking about, but makes me so happy to hear when I'm introducing amazing tools like this. So pod mapping comes from Mia Mingus, who is a transformative justice worker with the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And basically, it was built as a tool for folks to utilize in the sense of, if I am experiencing harm or I am harming someone else, who is my pod that can hold me accountable or help me during a crisis situation? And they started looking at the term pod because oftentimes the word community felt a little bit too vague, right? Like, you're part of the queer community, the trans community, and maybe you don't have really strong connections to folks within that. And so community sometimes can be a slightly vague term. So they are thinking about this, and I will in the follow-up resources link how to print this and some instructions. But essentially, you would write your name in the U kind of bubble, and the darker circles right around you are your pod. So this is people who you've had a conversation with. They know they're in your pod. People who you know are going to show up for you if you're in crisis or if you are harming someone else, right? To help you take accountability. The kind of dashed circles around the pod are movable folks. So those would be people who could be in your pod if you maybe put in a little bit more relationship building work with them. And then the outside, the larger bubble, the circles are different networks and communities that you can reach out to for support. Important notes is that there are a lot of circles here. The majority of people cannot fill all of these circles. It is very common that people have 1 or 2 people, sometimes no one in their pod. And it really serves as a way to recognize that, we may be students at, Carnegie Mellon or part of that larger community, but maybe we don't feel like we have those relationships, right? And that is something to think about, and definitely something that we use with our students to really figure out who are their people and how can they bring more of those movable folks into their direct pod. And again, I will follow up with that and printing some of those out, and you can make your own pod. I highly encourage that. Yeah, someone mentioned, I think in the chat, that they've heard about this in the COVID lens, that people have been making, pods for, COVID. And oh, I think I'm okay. I'm back. Sorry, y'all. Any questions on the kind of crisis response review before we move forward? We will be taking a break at some point, so hang with me, folks. All right, if anything comes up, feel free to throw it in the chat, and we will move into bystander intervention. So really at its core, I think for me, before I really was engaged in this work, a lot of what I knew about bystander intervention was in regards to sexual harassment, sexual assault, and interrupting that. But I want to encourage us to think of bystander intervention in a little bit more of a broad way, right? So recognizing a potentially harmful situation or interaction, and choosing to respond in a way that could positively influence the outcome. So, this could be a student having a mental health crisis. This could be, you're at a party on campus and campus police show up, and they might be harassing a student of color. And how are you going to, step in and be a bystander and intervene in that situation? So I do want Or if you're an administrator, right? A student comes into your office and has a panic attack and is just having a breakdown. How are you going to respond? And I think it's really important for us to have those skills and be thinking about all the different ways that it's applicable. Um, I want to read this quote from A Guide to Bystander Intervention Without Calling the Cops. It's an article in Vice, which says it's imperative to account for whether police may endanger marginalized people further before involving law enforcement in conflicts. If the perpetrator or victim of harm is Black, disabled, in mental health crisis, undocumented, etc., involving police could further escalate a situation. Involving cops in mental health crises can create a distrust for systems in general for those in crisis, making it less likely they would access social services in the future. So I do want to make a disclaimer, and I think I mentioned this towards the end of the training as well, that there are limited resources, right? Oftentimes people turn to 911 or to campus police because they don't know what else to do. And so it's really on us as community members to be building the systems of care that we want to see on our campuses, and not necessarily shaming people for engaging with these systems, because oftentimes it comes from a place of not knowing what other resources exist and what else to do. So I want to have that disclaimer. So if you're kind of sitting there being like, oh my God, student, um, recognizing that, you're not, it's not about you being a bad person. It is about a lack of potential resources. And with that, I also want to hold the reality that oftentimes, I will say 99% of the time, engaging with police is an escalation to what's happening. I've worked with many students who have been on campus in a mental health crisis, and all of a sudden campus police show up with guns at their dorm room while they're in the middle of a mental health crisis, and that is absolutely an escalation to what's happening, and can seriously disrupt that person's trust with their community members and people around them, and their willingness to continue engaging with systems of care in the future. So both of those things can be true, and definitely want to continue interrogating that. So some of y'all may have seen this before. This is kind of the more traditional classic information on bystander intervention. The 5 Ds you've probably heard of. These are kind of strategies you can use if someone is being harmed. But I also want to expand that, right? I think, again, our traditional thoughts around bystander intervention might be around, if somebody is being sexually harassed and how we can intervene. But I want us to really expand what that can look like and for different types of situations. So, kind of classic distracting could be taking an indirect approach, right? So, maybe trying to draw attention to something else that's happening in the room. We've also had students kind of create potentially their own, um, you know, crisis moment to draw attention to themselves and attention away from what is happening, and the harm that is taking place. Um, a direct approach is more in line with confronting that situation, right? Being really firm, clear, and concise with the person maybe who is perpetrating harm. That they've made it clear they're uncomfortable. Please leave them alone, and wanting to note that this is really if it's safe to do so and to engage with that directly. Um, and we'll talk a little bit about strategies for direct intervention in a moment. The delegate role, we have seeking help from another person. Um, so a lot of folks have mentioned that we're not sure right where that line is of how to do that while respecting autonomy, respecting consent, and we will talk about that. Document is something that comes up, a lot, especially now. Everyone has a phone with the capability to take videos, to take. Oop, sorry, y'all, my mic is just cutting out a little bit. We want to make sure that we have um consent from a person, right? If we're documenting a situation, we want to make sure that we do whatever that person wants done with the documentation. We don't ever share it without their permission, and we have as much consent as possible in those moments. and delay. So that's really thinking about maybe you're not able to support that person in that moment, but figuring out a way to check in with them later, or following up with that person after the situation has resolved, and continuing to check in on folks. So that's something important about crisis response. A lot of people think it ends the moment that that peak crisis ends, and that's actually not really how it works. It's more of, it's not linear like that, and the kind of consequences or fallouts from a crisis can continue happening, even after that peak has fallen. And I see a question in the chat, Francisco. I will get to that in a little bit. I want to make sure we have time to go through some more practice scenarios. Okay. So some thoughts on direct intervention. These are strategies that we can use if it's safe, if we have permission, right, from the person who was harmed. And that can be, as quick as just saying, are you comfortable if I do X? Is it okay if I do X? Do you want me to do X? Right? We want to always be diverting back to the desires of that person who's being directly impacted. So thinking about, making it personal, that could be a strategy that works for some folks, bringing it home, right, making something really personal. Using I statements, I think, is really helpful in moments, where if we kind of approach it from like, you're doing X, that tends to show that we're placing blame on someone else, whether or not that blame deserves to be there. Using I statements, starting with an I statement of, I feel uncomfortable when you're doing X, I feel scared when you're doing X. Really, it's much harder to challenge that and to dismiss that when someone is using those I statements. We've also had some folks who've had a lot of success with humor. It doesn't mean that the situation is unimportant, but some people have, a knack for using humor in rough situations that can really cut tension and try to build some bridges in that moment. That's definitely, only feel comfortable if that's more in line with your personality. We want to thinking about calling in versus calling out, right? So we're using our positions as community members to show both care and hold people accountable, especially in a university. Okay, we're back. Especially in a university setting, sometimes there are, situations where someone who is an employee or staff or administrator for a university may be in a better position to hold a fellow person who also works for the university accountable. Rather, we see a lot of organizing on campus around, certain harms that come out of that setting. So really thinking about how each of us can use our power and our positionality, to hold people accountable and ensure that everyone in our community is safe. We also, can think about how to make a plan. We want to be naming maybe what those concerning behaviors are in a moment, be really setting those clear expectations and working to figure out some next steps. And again, collaborating when you can, right? So we want to always try to work with a person to plan for change. I'm going to like probably repeat that 1,000 times. But it's so important to recognize that we are not the driver of this car, right? When someone else is in crisis, we are there to support them. And recognizing that is our role, I think helps reduce a lot of the anxiety we have around like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? Right. That's kind of where we start, that we are not, the driver of that car. Okay, so we are going to um, do some practice scenarios. So everyone is going to be assigned to a breakout room. Depending on your room number, you will discuss a different scenario. And you're going to talk about what you are going to do in this situation. And I want to stress that, you're not going to have a ton of time. And that is actually quite realistic, right? Because when we're thinking about crisis situations, we don't have a lot of time. If somebody texts you that they think that they were sexually assaulted, you have to respond in that moment, right? You don't have like 3 hours to think about how are you going to say it right? Maybe you have a little bit of time, but most likely things are going to happen quickly. So let me get this set up. We have 37. Okay. So what I'm sending right now in the chat is a link to open the scenarios. And let me know if you can't I will post them in the chat just in case you can't open it. And ignore the room numbers. It's going to be slightly different. So we have 37. So rooms 1 and 2.
You cut out on us for a minute.
Okay, rooms 1 and 2 will be doing scenario 1. Rooms 3 through 5 will be doing the second scenario. Rooms 6 through 7 will be doing the panic attack scenario, and rooms 8 through 9 will be doing the sexual assault scenario. Was everyone able to open the document? Is there anyone who can't see it? Okay, let's let you all know that our team we've typed up pretty in-depth responses to each scenario of what we would do, what we would say. So we have a whole guide that I'm going to share with y'all right after we kind of get some thoughts here. I don't want to give all the spoilers away. But yeah, if we can hear from folks who had the first scenario. So just in case you weren't part of this group, basically you are a freshman, you don't really know anyone yet. During your first week of school, you go to the bathroom late at night and you find another student cleaning blood off their arm. You recognize it as self-harm and you see other scars on their arms and legs. So what do you do? So if folks from that group want to share some thoughts.
I guess we were in room 2, so we had this scenario, and it's funny because I am an administrator, and my first response was I wasn't really keyed in on the I'm a freshman thing, and so my first response was to kind of think that I would walk over and say, can I help? And then some of our other group members said, well, wait a minute, we're freshmen, we don't know anyone. What if we took the approach of, hey, I'm new here too, and I don't really know anyone, and it's kind of stressful right now. Would you ever want to talk sometime? So kind of putting yourself not in the same position as the student, but just showing that vulnerability and see if you can forge that relationship. Because what we talked about is if we said like, are you okay? They'll probably just brush it off and say, oh, I'm fine. I had an accident or something, and make it really hard for you to do anything, versus if you try to build that relationship. And then the other question that came up was, would we, as an 18-year-old freshman, be likely to immediately go to an RA, not really having a good feel for, is this a situation where the student is in danger or not? I'm not sure. I better tell someone, and kind of the pros and cons of telling the RA versus, trying to build the trust with that student and see if you can help them get help like over a longer term. So I don't know if anyone else from my group wants to throw in, but.
Thanks, Catherine. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Catherine, I was in the same group with Catherine, and Catherine had a really great suggestion too, which was to perhaps, again, thinking you're just like in the bathroom in the middle of the night, and maybe it is a quick interaction, but maybe the next day to call, even anonymously call something like CAPS to ask for their advice, to see what they might recommend you do as a follow-up, to get a second opinion.
Awesome. I'm only going to take like 2 thoughts per group so we can get through a little bit more. But I will say, like, it's excellent what you mentioned, Catherine, about building a relationship, right? We want to kind of approach that situation, maybe say something like, hey, like, I know we don't know each other, but my name is Stephanie. Do you need any support right now? Right. So kind of maybe not, making it a huge thing right away. I think it's also important for us to know, especially as administrators, that self-harm is more considered what is called in a clinical space as like a maladaptive coping mechanism, right? It is not inherently linked to being suicidal. It could be a suicide attempt, but more likely it is a maladaptive coping mechanism, right? So we want to try to de-link our thoughts that immediately, oh my God, this person is at risk of killing themselves. I think what you mentioned, Liz, about calling anonymously to get advice is a really good idea. This scenario actually happened to me my freshman year at Brown, and the student said nothing to me in the bathroom. They saw me, didn't engage, and I got a knock on my door from an RA about 15 minutes later, and I was like terrified. I was like, oh my God, like, am I being like surveilled? Like, what's happening? And it kind of made me shut down and not want to seek help. So I love what you all are saying about building a relationship, trying to engage. I do want to say, if it's a situation where someone is clearly bleeding very heavily and you can't stop the bleeding, it's, you know, an ethical and moral necessity to intervene in a life-saving manner. And if that does happen, asking them if you can stay with them, telling them, listen, you're bleeding a lot. I'm going to have to try and get some medical support for you, but can I stay with you and I can help advocate for you? What do you need in this situation, right? But we want to make sure that it hasn't escalated, right, to that level. If it's kind of, you see the self-harm scars, they're taking care of it. We want to not, you know, stare and make them feel like we're, you know, like there's some alien, right? Relationship building is going to be key there. And again, we have a whole document with a bunch of, you know, a more in-depth response to go through. I want to try and get through these just quick thoughts about the scenarios before we run out of time. And if folks can hang out for a couple of minutes after, we might run over a bit. So the next scenario was, you know, you are talking with your roommate when you notice outside of your dorm room window, a student you don't know appears to be behaving strangely. So they are, you know, they're not wearing a shirt, they're dancing in an unusual and highly energetic way. And you hear people around you in the hallway kind of talking about it, and, you know, maybe a little bit concerned, but mostly amused and kind of mocking the student. You don't really find it funny, but, you know, you're curious as to how you could help. And 30 minutes later, they start yelling and singing very loudly. So what do you do in that scenario? Would love to hear like 2 thoughts from folks who had that question.
Sure, Stephanie, I'll jump in. In our group, much like in Catherine's group, we first approached it as staff because we're in that mindset. But once we kind of thought as a student, you know, we thought talking to our RA would be the first step to make sure that they know about the situation going on outside. And, you know, and then maybe depending on what the weather's like, maybe going outside with the roommate with like a sweatshirt or something to offer it to the student to kind of approach them, you know, carefully, but they might be more receptive to a peer than like if one of us as a staff member would be headed out there to talk to them.
Thank you, Andrea. Yeah, I want to, I think it's important what you said, because that is a lot of people's first response. Like, where's the authority person? Like, let me bring them into the situation. And I want to push back on that slightly by, you know, I think in our society, in our culture, we've tended to outsource everything, right? And we've kind of lost a lot of our inherent abilities to engage in like conflict resolution or address difficult circumstances, because we're like, okay, call this person, call that person. So we want to suggest in that moment that the first thing you do is what you mentioned as the next step, to go out there and actually build that point of connection and that relationship again, and kind of see, you know, again, like, hey, my name is Stephanie. What's your name? How are you doing? And thinking that we want to try and engage without necessarily escalating it at that moment. But thank you for that. Any other thoughts on that scenario?
Yeah, our group talked about, you know, if you're in a dorm, you have a host of people who can help you. And so it's like, hey, does anyone recognize that person? Does anyone know who their friends are? Like, can a couple of us go out and engage them and be like, hey, what song are you singing? Like, hey, how's your night going? You seem to be having a good time, and kind of assess the situation before immediately deciding how we're going to react without engaging. And then saying, okay, this person's like really clearly drunk. Can we help them get home somehow and like call them a lift or whatever? Or they seem to be really having an episode, and can we help de-escalate and help them? And I think having the RA as an option, having a house fellow as an option, and other things could be okay. Maybe having someone on the phone with CAPS to say, hey, you know, we're seeing this. Is there anything that we should be doing in the moment? And kind of getting that perspective, but not kind of freaking someone out who may just be, you know, not aware of their behavior in the moment and may be able to self-regulate if you're like, hey, like it's a little bit late, what's going on?
Love that, Mark. Thank you for that. I think one of the most important things with this scenario I want to highlight is that, you might perceive that person to be in distress, but they might not perceive themselves to be in distress, right? Like to them, they might be like having a fabulous time, right? We've all probably seen someone who's been way too intoxicated and they don't see an issue. They're like, woohoo, party. So that's a really important distinction I want to make. And I think, it's interesting. I see this all the time that people tend to like have much more capacity for helping and know what to do in a moment like that. If someone's intoxicated, right? Or I've seen students on campuses like de-escalate students who maybe took like a psychedelic, like acid, and are having a really bad trip and have been able to kind of de-escalate and guide them and keep them safe and calm. And I think, the main difference between someone being intoxicated or having taken a drug and someone in a mental health crisis is that in the former, like we know what caused it and we know it's going to end, right? When someone's in a mental health crisis, we don't always know what's caused it and we don't know when or if it's going to end, right? So that tends to stress people out. And then they act like, I don't know how to respond. When, if that person was intoxicated, we might be like, okay, they need to just like get to a more safe place for this moment. Another skill I would suggest, like checking in, building the relationship as Mark said, but potentially, saying something along the lines of, listen, I'm not, scared by you. I don't think you're doing anything wrong, but there are other people on campus who may perceive this to be a crisis situation. And I really don't want, campus police to be called on you. So would you want to come inside my dorm and hang out for a bit? Right. So thinking about ways that, we can use our language to suggest that even if I don't think you're in a crisis, someone else might. And I want to help you kind of get out of that environment. And again, have a lot of in-depth suggestions for that, but really thinking about, that connection is key. And I think a lot of people, we see someone we may not know, and we're like, that's not our problem. And we need to start feeling like it is our problem, right? We're all in community together. I love what Mark said about trying to say, hey, does anyone know this person? Is anyone, friends with this person? It was a great suggestion. Thank you all for that. All right, let's move along. We are running out of time. All good. Next scenario was you're in the dining hall, which is packed. You hear someone sitting nearby crying. You look over and realize you don't know them. Other people seem to be concerned and unsure what to do. The person then starts hyperventilating and trying to say that they can't breathe. So what do you do? Thoughts from folks who had this scenario?
Yeah, I'll jump in and share from our group. If the other group has things, please interrupt me. So one of the things we talked about is that we clearly knew that this was a panic attack because it's labeled as such, but in real life, we might not actually know that this is a panic attack. So starting with some simple questions to assess like, hey, are you having a medical emergency? Are you having a panic attack? Really simple yes or no questions if they're not able to clearly communicate, and try and suss out what's going on for them. And because we're a stranger in the situation, we really emphasize consent at every step of the way with every question, like hey, can I sit with you? Do you need anything? Do you want to go outside, etc.? Yes or no questions to keep it really simple, but try and move them, if they're okay with it, outside of that place where it's less crowded so they maybe can calm down. We also kind of went down the path of like, maybe they say no and they don't want support and they don't want to go outside, and how we could be supportive in that way. And talked about how, similar to what you were just talking about, there might be people in the environment who are like panicking about this and want to escalate it, and kind of doing crowd control with other people to say like, no, this person's fine. They said they just needed some time and some space. Let's let them calm down.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Noah. So I think, even the first step, right? If someone is not able to control their breathing, even instead of saying like, are you having a panic attack? In that moment, does that really matter? Like, not really, right? Because they're not able to breathe. Everything else you said, fabulous. But I want to point out that in that moment, the core goal is getting them to breathe and try to regulate that. One of the best techniques we know is mirroring, right? So if I'm looking at you and I say, can you breathe with me, right? Let's breathe together, right? That mirroring, we have these like amazing neural, mirror neurons, that kind of get activated when we are kind of copying someone. So asking them to breathe with you. There is, how many of y'all have heard of like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 approach? Yeah, so asking like, name 5 things that you can see, 4 things you can smell, 3 things you can taste, 2 things you can touch, etc. And that, helping someone to get grounded in that moment. As Noah mentioned, consent, super important. And, figuring out, doing like a quick needs assessment around, do they want to be like escorted out of this, cafeteria. Crowd control is super important, making sure people aren't staring, aren't laughing, aren't engaging with those systems that we're trying to avoid in that moment, right? If someone's having a panic attack and you freak out and call campus police or EMS, that might trigger them even more, right? So a lot of these scenarios, we want to be thinking of what are those skills that we can use in that moment. And then the follow-up, right? The delay. Maybe we don't know this person, but we want to introduce ourselves and offer ourselves as a resource for support, even after you've de-escalated the initial crisis. So thank you for that, Noah. I'm going to move on quickly to the last scenario so we can get through a little bit more of what I wanted to before we have to end for the day. So this is a sexual assault scenario. You get a call from your friend at about 6 a.m. She's saying that she had a very upsetting sexual experience with someone that she met at a party the night before. Maya, your friend, just wanted to dance and make out, but the person kept pressuring Maya, and eventually they just froze up. They stopped saying no and gave in. They don't really remember much besides that, except that the person didn't use any protection. You think that Maya was raped, but Maya isn't using that terminology to describe the experience. What do you do? Any thoughts from folks who had that group?
I think we determined we needed to determine where she was and if she was safe at that moment. And then we talked about maybe getting her help and either from UHS or calling someone else, whatever she actually felt comfortable with at that moment.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. In the sake of time, we're just going to take one response, but a couple of things to note. In this scenario, the core thing to prioritize is providing support and letting them lead, right? Even if in your mind, you're like, this person was sexually assaulted or raped is what you're thinking. We want to encourage you not to use that language right away because they're not using that language. And we want to kind of wait for them to define the experience on their own terms. We can talk about, you can just ask, like, are there any terms you want to use to describe this experience? Do you want to avoid terms altogether right now? Some people just might not be in a place right away where they're able to say, I was raped. And we can talk about it without using that terminology. So that's first and foremost. Also want to, in terms of listening, we want to make sure not to press this friend for details. I think that's a really inherent kind of response. We want to know like what happened, right? And I've seen this a lot, especially from people who've had past experience with sexual violence. So I've been in this scenario where I have been sexually assaulted, providing support to someone else, and my kind of fight or flight kicked in, and I was kind of immediately like, okay, like, what happened? Where were you? What are the details? Like, let's get you to health services. You have to do X, Y, and Z. And, was informed, this was many years ago, how violent that was in that moment to just be asking for all these things to happen, right? We don't want to pressure someone. There are ways to gently remind someone that, hey, I just want you to know that there are, time limits for certain testing. So if you did want to go to health services, I could come with you. I could be your advocate. There are just some time limits around things. So, we have to make a decision about that rather than, being more aggressive about it, right? And asking, what would support look for you right now, right? We want to validate what they're going through. And have, be following their lead. We also don't want to assume they want to be touched, right? And providing kind of contact. We want to ask about that. And last but not least, we want to, by any means, not force them to engage with the criminal legal system, right? I think that comes up a lot for people, and something, you see a lot in like media is like, oh, like, you have to protect other people. This person might, be harming someone else, so you have to report it. And pressuring someone to report it is just not the way that we want to go there. So, I hope, we kind of see a commonality here of letting folks lead. I'm going to share the answer key-ish. Everything is up to interpretation with you, and it will be shared in the follow-up scenarios as well. I have a little bit more content to go through around crisis response. We are supposed to end in about 4 minutes. I think, Noah, would it be okay to go a few minutes over?
I'm fine with that. Folks who can't
Okay.
stay, I understand. Do what you need to do.
Yeah, so if you have to leave, that is okay. This is being recorded and we will send it out. And we will just try and get through a couple more pieces that are super important. Okay, so kind of when we're thinking about priorities in this moment, right, we want to think about the goal. The first goal is stabilizing, safety, stabilization, and connection. Rather than coming to it from a lens of power, we want to connect. We also want to do like a quick kind of needs assessment, right? What's happening? Is there, really bright lighting, really loud noises? We're in the cafeteria. Do we want to kind of move locations? Taking kind of an assessment of the environment is what we consider to be like a needs assessment. And then we want to address the core need, right? With the panic attack, maybe that is they need to breathe, right? If the person is bleeding out, they need medical attention. So we want to be thinking of what is that core need? How do we address it in that moment? And asking questions. And then creating the long-term plan, right? Following up. If this is someone you don't know, building that connection, super important. I mentioned this earlier, that the person in crisis is the expert of their own body mind, right? Oftentimes people know what helps them in a crisis, what they need, and our job is to listen, right? Also, you don't know everything and you probably can't do it alone. But as I mentioned, getting other people and other resources involved should never come at the expense of compromising the autonomy of the person in crisis. And this is definitely a hard balance and a hard act. And something that takes practice and takes time for sure. We also know that crises can be made a lot worse if people start reacting with fear, control, and anger. There are plenty of studies that show that if you react to someone in crisis with that caring openness, that patience, it can really help to settle things down. I'm going to skip this slide for now. It's some questions on how to build your own crisis plan. In the follow-up materials, I'm going to include a template for how to build a crisis plan and what that looks like for you. It's fairly self-explanatory, so I'm going to move forward for now. And this, I'm not going to go through it in depth right now. It is kind of an overview of the kind of crisis approach that we use at Project Let's in terms of a mental health crisis. Kind of, from like a 1 to 8 or 9, however many there are here, of like a checklist of things that we can do in a crisis moment, where oftentimes people kind of panic, right, and go to that escalated level. But we want to be thinking of, have we asked them what they need? Have we held space to just talk? Have we made sure basic needs are met? Food, sleep, those kind of basic needs can often, if they're not being met, they can throw people into crisis. And we want to be making sure that we can maybe create a sanctuary, a safer place, and meet those needs. Trying de-escalation, really assessing risk, checking to see if they have an existing provider or support system, they have a crisis plan, and thinking about maybe some urgent community-based resources before engaging with some of the more authority aspects of care. I love this graphic. This is talking about how there are different types of suicidal ideation. So I think a lot of folks think that if someone is having suicidal thoughts, that means that they are in danger mode, right? And need, support right away. And I want to encourage folks to look through this graphic on your own time about how, there's so many levels, having thoughts about suicide with no intent or plan, having suicidal thoughts where you have maybe an idea of the method you would use, but you don't have a plan and you don't have the intent right now, all the way up to actually engaging in a suicide attempt. So we want to be thinking about how, it is okay to have suicidal thoughts. That does not mean that someone is in immediate crisis and immediate danger. And we want to be thinking about where they are on this scale before we might get other folks involved. Just some other quick crisis reminders. It's helpful to be able to work in teams. Again, knowing that lack of sleep can be a major contributor to crises. Drugs may also be a factor in crises, whether those are prescriptions that we've been prescribed, new prescriptions we just started or stopped. And again, meeting those basic needs can be so critically important. Just some quick thoughts here on de-escalation. So as I mentioned, we don't want to assume that folks who are acting, quote, strangely, are in acute crisis, right? Thinking about that student who is dancing and seemed to be having a good time, even though you perceive them to be doing something, quote, strange or, quote, weird, they are probably not in a crisis if they're not, dictating that to you and appearing to be in distress. So there are certain behaviors that we kind of pathologize as being in a crisis, and we want to kind of try to unlearn that. But then there are other certain kind of behaviors, right? Appearing agitated, maybe irritable, having suicidal gestures or threats, self-injurious behavior, that could be a sign of requiring intervention. And if we take it upon ourselves to intervene in these moments, the goal is to de-escalate, not further escalate. And de-escalation, at its core is really, a mindset, language, and actions that we take when we're trying to connect with someone experiencing emotional distress or harm. As we've kind of mentioned several times, introducing yourself to start, making sure the person knows who you are, right, really demonstrates openness, empathy. It also helps to ratchet down something that might be really intense. And again, people often know what they need, what soothes them, and we should not discount the expertise they have about their own minds and bodies. So just some more like pointers and tips for folks. As we mentioned, the first step, really that stabilization, that connection. We want to focus on helping that person find and access physical and emotional safety. And we want to ask directly, like, what do you need from me to be able to trust my help? Especially if they don't know you, that's a great question to ask. And working with them, right, as opposed to telling them what to do. We want to keep their voice and their choice centered. So can you tell me what you need? What usually helps you when you feel like this? If someone's having a panic attack, right? We can ask that question. What feels best for you? Here are the resources that I know. And we also, really important, want to consider those power dynamics, right, around historical oppression that may be present due to identities such as race, ethnicity, gender, or past experiences of trauma. So we can think also about the delegate skill from bystander intervention if other help is needed. There might be someone on your team that may be better able to respond based on some shared identity and experiences. And you can ask that person if they'd like to talk to someone in their support network or yours. And again, medical emergencies, we want to inform the person of what we're doing. Even if we have to call for backup, we still want folks to know, right, and tell them that. And as I mentioned with the panic attack scenario, right, one of the goals in the beginning is grounding and co-regulation. We know from research, from neuroscience, that co-regulation, breathing together, grounding together, is really, really critical and helpful. So asking that person to take deep breaths with you, keep going until your breaths match, asking folks to identify things, to describe the room in great detail, helping to distract themselves, and again, using that delay skill potentially from bystander intervention to check back and see if you can support later, or if they need additional help. This slide is, there's a lot of text. I acknowledge there's a lot of text, but I want y'all to have this as a resource to follow up on your own of things to do in crisis and not do. On the don't side, we're thinking about making demands. We don't want to stand in people's personal space. Use a loud voice. If someone is sitting down, we want to meet them on their level. We don't want to, be above them and kind of staring down at them. If someone is paranoid and in an altered state, we don't want to be talking about them, while they're over there and we're here and kind of talking about what to do. That can increase paranoia, right? And things we want to do, as I've mentioned, and Noah said it really well, asking simple questions one at a time, plain language, yes or no questions, really, being direct, and again, asking choices, helping that person feel safe and in control. Also want to quickly mention that, you know, if someone in crisis has a weapon, like a knife, for example, or a razor, oftentimes we know that it's going to be in self-defense because they might be scared or experiencing paranoia. So sometimes you can say to someone, if that happens, you know, I see you're holding a knife in your hand. Are you feeling scared right now? Can you trust me enough to put that knife down while we talk? Or I know you won't hurt anybody, but I'm concerned there are other people around who may think you'll hurt somebody. So can you put it down? You know, we've seen a lot of times folks who are in psychiatric crises who may pick up a weapon in self-defense who are then, you know, killed for that action. So thinking as well about, you know, and of course there are limits with, you know, how we feel with our own safety, but thinking potentially about how we can work to de-escalate that situation. Got a few more slides, so thank y'all for hanging in with me. Again, thinking about altered states, mania, psychosis, I want us to kind of slow down and recognize that we are probably not in danger simply because someone is behaving in an unconventional way, right? Also, you know, I think we're taught, and clinically this comes up a lot, that if somebody is experiencing what you would refer to as a quote delusion, that we have to tell them, right, that it's a delusion. So if a student came to you and said, like, I'm being spied on by the NSA, you know, you may have been taught to say, like, no, you're not, like, that's a delusion. But what we've seen work really well is asking questions, right, inquiring. Just because, you know, that person is having a different reality experience than you are, doesn't mean we should discount it. And we want to affirm that what they're experiencing is real. You know, there are moments like if someone says, someone's following me, someone's standing right there, where, you know, I've taken a photo and showed them and said, no, there's no one, you're safe right now, and showed them that. But most of the time engaging with them and asking questions about what their reality experience is like is really, really helpful, as opposed to just dismissing it. And we also have to think about how race ties into this, right? You know, and thinking about folks' paranoia, that is actually very much grounded in this level of reality, and thinking about how different identity factors contribute to who is believed more and who is not. So someone just asked, what types of questions would not be threatening? You know, for example, so, you know, I was in an experience with a student who told me that, you know, they thought I was part of, you know, the NSA spying on them, and asking questions around, like, okay, I hear you. You know, why do you feel that way? You know, what have you been thinking about? What have you seen? What have you heard? You know, are you feeling safe here? Is there someone we can go to help you feel safer? Basically, you know, doing what we've been talking about through this training, that de-escalation, with the added layer of not dismissing their reality, unless it's a situation where, you know, they are terrified of something that they're seeing that you're not, which is when I would kind of move into a skill set of trying to show them, like, look, there's no one here right now, and here's the proof. I just took a photo of my phone. That's the kind of only time where I would really move into a place of trying to show them that what they're thinking that they see is not here in this realm of reality. Otherwise, I try very much so to stay with them where they are, meet them where they are. And if you are feeling, you know, threatened by them directly, my first thought would be to interrogate that and see, are you really in danger, or is it your kind of learned understanding that folks in altered states are dangerous? And if there is an actual threat, that is when we would want to be delegating to have folks coming in for backup and support. And we want to bring folks in again who are going to help de-escalate that situation. Also want to quickly mention that, you know, mental health issues that are related to trauma typically, you know, have an intuitive logic to how they unfold, right? So if, you know, there is an intuitive logic around how to de-escalate. So if someone's paranoid, we want to help them feel safe. You know, it makes sense for someone with a trauma background to relive that fear and sometimes misdirect it. So if we can think about it in that way of, like, what makes most intuitive sense in this moment to help this person calm down, you know, that's what we want to be doing. And thinking about, in these moments, centering that, a fellow student or your friend's pursuit and personal definitions of wellness and joy is really the key when making decisions. We want to not think about what we need and what we want in that moment, but be centering, that person. Also, really quickly, so we just had someone in the chat asking about, what happens if they get physical. So I would encourage folks to just, be thinking about that along the lines of, whether they're in a mental health crisis or not, what we would do in that moment, right? And if we are considering action, which means, we're thinking about maybe calling campus police or EMS, we want to be working to preserve and maximize autonomy all the way through. If we have to get other systems involved, we still want to tell folks what's going to happen. If it's decided this person maybe needs to be removed from a particular point of campus, are there other crisis resources in the community that we can think of before engaging with 911? Something that I've seen a lot is that a student might know that they are in emotional distress. They actually aren't opposed to a hospital type of situation, but they're really scared of police involvement. So something that we've done, we've offered to drive folks to the hospital, got Ubers with them, and visited daily, right? So that they aren't feeling alone. So thinking about, even in that last case scenario, there are still ways to preserve and maximize autonomy. Back to, I think it was Eva who just asked this question about, if somebody gets physical, if you do involve police, details make a real difference for harm reduction. Very quickly, I was involved in a scenario at Brown where, there was a student who was having an extended, psychotic episode, manic episode, and we set up shifts in their home of folks who were kind of sitting with them and hanging out with them, coloring and drawing with them. This person really just wanted to be listening to music on their laptop and drawing. And it was about 4 or 5 days that we were kind of doing that community-led solution. And then it got to the point where they just weren't sleeping, and it escalated the psychosis. And it's important to remember that can happen to anyone, whether or not you have diagnosed mental illness. Enough sleep deprivation will throw anybody into an episode of psychosis. It was one of the only times in my life and professional career that I made the call to call emergency medical services, and this person was needing medical attention. And in this case, when we called, I indicated that I was an advocate and I would be with this person. I explained beforehand what was going on. I asked if there were any responders who were specifically trained in crisis intervention, if they could send those folks. When they arrived, they were really quick to want to put this person on a stretcher and take them. And I'm white, and I have training, and I physically use my body as a barrier between the police officers, the EMTs, and the person in crisis, and said, we are going to basically stay here as long as it takes until we can get them to voluntarily get in the ambulance on their own and de-escalate. They were not interested in de-escalation. They just wanted to get her and go. And again, if it's safe to do so, I encourage that type of, putting yourself in that type of position. It took about an hour, and we were able to get her to get in the ambulance on her own. And so there are ways, even in the worst case scenario, to still maximize that autonomy, and be recognizing, the risks and how we could disrupt some of those risks. And again, to Eva's question, we want to be always asking ourselves, why am I calling? What are my intentions? What needs are being met? And whose needs are being met, right? Are they mine? Or are they the person who needs support? Is it about my own fear or my compassionate concern for the other person? And thinking about, are we actually in danger? Okay. The last few slides, I'm going to encourage you all to go through on your own because we're 15 minutes over. I'm so sorry. Thinking about boundary setting in a crisis moment, what to do if you are triggered, and how to do some self-regulation. I am going to follow up with Noah after this to make sure that you all have the resources I mentioned and linked. I will be sending as well a feedback form over. Would be really grateful if you could fill that out and let us know
what you learned, what you thought of the training. And again, I am always happy to talk to folks one-on-one if you have a specific situation, a specific question. I just threw my email in the chat. Very happy to connect and talk to folks more. But thank you all for your time, for staying a few minutes extra. I really appreciate it. And yeah, would love to hear how we can continue supporting you all in the future. So hope you have a wonderful day.
Yes, thank you all for being here, and thank you